Uh, it's a pleasure to be here this evening as part of your lecture series, the Eastvale lecture series. A lot of my colleagues are part of that series, and it seems like you guys have done a tremendous job of educating and sort of communicating and engaging your community. And the focus in the sort of the theme of my presentation tonight is missing middle housing, but I like to the subtitle is equally as important. I think it's thinking big but building small to respond to today's housing crisis, and it's also the needs of communities. And just like this general plan process that you are all going through, I feel like there's the reason that the concept of missing middle housing has spread so broadly, not just up and down California, but also nationally and internationally, is that it's given communities a different and a better way to communicate about the housing needs and housing choices that the community wants and that they really need. And I'll just say that if you are, for those of you who are listening either live or are going to be watching this as a recording, please do feel free to sort of use social media to help communicate to your broader community about this concept. Um, you know, uh, the reality is that across the country, there's a tremendous gap between the types of housing that people want, that households want, and that's being delivered. And that missing middle housing is one of the tools that we recommend that every city have in their toolbox to help sort of deliver housing that sort of helps fill this gap and delivers the housing that people's want and need. And I think part of this is, this is a great, this is a photograph from a great little Cottage Court project that was one of the case studies in my missing middle housing book. And it's just a really great example of a type of housing that doesn't really easily fit into the classifications we as planners, we as architects, developers, decision makers, sort of these categories that we make in terms of multifamily housing, single family housing. And it kind of fits uncomfortably somewhere right in the middle of that. So we have to think more creatively about what the plans that we're writing, the policies that we're writing, and ultimately the zoning regulations that we're writing that can enable this great housing choice that is in really high demand, that people really respond to very well, and in a way that's reinforced by all those different planning sort of exercises. And so I'd like to start my presentation talking about sort of laying a really nice foundation about why this concept of the missing middle housing is so important, and why it's why the city of Eastvale decided this was one of the most important topics to host a presentation on. And the first one is that there's been a tremendous shift in household demographics over the course. I mean, this hasn't happened overnight, but it's really caught most cities, most developers by surprise. And the fact that 30% of all households, regardless of where you're at in the country, are composed of a single person, right? And I can guarantee that 1/3 of all housing that's being delivered in a community like yours or any community across the country isn't designed and built specifically for the needs of a single person household. So we need to think about, well, what barriers can remove that can deliver housing to meet that need. Then another somewhat staggering statistic, and I've presented this many times, but it still sort of shocks me a little bit, that by 2025, that up to 85% of households will not have children. So once again, this sort of kind of, I call it the sort of this 1950s, 1960s idea of this nuclear family with two parents, a couple, two or three kids. It's less and less of a percentage of the overall population. So we need to be thinking about, once again, what are the different needs of those households with smaller household compositions, and how can we write a general plan, how can we write policy and zoning that can sort of help deliver that. And then we have a rapidly aging population as well. By 2030, 1 in 5 Americans will be over the age of 65. So we definitely need to be thinking about what that means in terms of the types of communities, but also the housing that we deliver. And then, it's no surprise for those of us in California that, between 2005 and 2015, that Latinos will account for over 60% of the nation's population growth. So, right, if you're not paying attention to this and responding to it as a city in your policy and your planning, like that's a real challenge. So like we need to make sure that we're thinking about this in efforts like you're embarking on in your general plan, and how that will influence the type of housing that a city like Eastvale can deliver to respond to these shifting changes in our household demographics and population generally. And so Chris Nelson, who's a one of the nation's experts on housing demand and also shifting household demographics, wrote a chapter in my book on, he did some analysis and research on the demand for missing middle. And he, to this point of sort of an aging population, he found in his research that households over the age of 65 will represent almost 80% of the housing demand between now and 2040. So once again, we need to be aware of that. We need to be making decisions based on that type of information, because those older households, they want smaller homes, they want smaller lots, less maintenance. They want to be able to lock it off and go, visit their grandchildren or go on a vacation or go on interesting trips. They want security and they want walkability. So we need to be thinking about all of those things and how we can deliver them. This has become such a prominent need in a conversation that even AARP has really engaged in this missing middle conversation, as well as the walkability conversation in their livable communities. We've actually been working, we were hired by AARP, I think just a little over 2 years ago, to educate their membership about the benefits and values of these broad range of missing middle housing choices, and more specifically, these housing choices in walkable communities. And this ties really nicely into their livability index, which I just encourage you to take a look at if you're not aware of that. The other thing outside of the shifting demographics that sort of makes this a really important conversation is that there's been a tremendous and growing shift in the demand for walkable living. And the two biggest market segments, the baby boomers and the millennials, want this. 2/3 of millennials want walkable living, a third of baby boomers. That's a lot of people. And we're not delivering walkability and the walkable living at a rate that is meeting this demand. And so once again, cities can position themselves very well economically, placemaking, sort of community building standpoint, if they can respond to this shift in demand for the walkability. I mean, you saw it in the word cloud earlier, is that people want walkability, they want mixed use, they want a nightlife. So how can a city sort of effectively and creatively integrate those sorts of ideas in the general plan update? And right, I think it's no surprise to anybody, especially those of us here in California, that we have a rapidly growing affordability crisis related to housing that's not really showing any signs of slowing down. And just another important statistic is that in 2017, that over a third of all American households were housing cost burdened, which meant they were spending over a third of their income on just housing. And so that's sort of a sign that we need to be thinking more creatively about more attainable housing choices in a variety of different approaches. And missing middle is one of those that I mentioned earlier that every city should have in their toolbox. And the other point that I like to make in terms of why this is important is because the rules for development, or what we as planners call the zoning, is really an out-of-date operating system. And it's almost 100 years old. It was created about the same year that this camera was built, and it's still in operation or trying to operate, trying to deliver these housing choices, but is just doing a really ineffective job because it's an out-of-date operating system. So part of this is, let's update the general plan. Let's also think about how these rules, the zoning that we have, need to be modified to effectively regulate for this new way and these new types of housing, including these missing middle housing choices. So now jumping into, so what is missing middle housing? It's a term that sort of is fairly broadly used, and we have a pretty specific definition for this. I think is really important for everybody to understand. So looking at this diagram here, on the left-hand side, you have single family detached houses. I think we've written good planning documents, good zoning. We have development industry set up to deliver single family homes. We've done a great job of that. On the far right-hand side, are sort of the larger mixed use, sort of 3, 4, 5+ story apartment or condo buildings. And over the course of the last 15 to 20 years, most cities have removed barriers, enabled this through their planning, and developers have figured out how to make them work and to deliver them in most markets. But what the missing middle is this broad range of housing choices. It's duplexes, it's fourplexes, it's cottage courts, mansion apartments that exist in every neighborhood built prior to the 1940s, but really we stopped building them. I'll talk a little bit about barriers, but there's a lot of different reasons that they're missing. And we need to really think about policies, planning strategies, and efforts within our cities to enable these broad range of housing choices, once again, to meet these shifting demands and the needs of our communities. And so if you're gonna walk away from this presentation with one concept, or if you're gonna take one screenshot, like take it of this one, is that missing middle housing are house scale buildings with multiple units in walkable neighborhoods. And that house scale is the most important concept to take away from this. Is though a lot of people, the second they start thinking about multifamily, which is a terminology we use to classify this in our planning documents, or apartments, we think of bigger buildings. Maybe we start thinking they're out of scale with our community. But the important concept of missing middle is they're buildings that are still the scale of a house. They just happen to have multiple units inside of them. And I'll show some photo examples as I work my way through the presentation. And what's fantastic about this idea is that, and we couldn't be happier to see, not only is this being applied across the United States to help meet different cities and communities' needs, but it's also being applied internationally now, which is really exciting for us to see. So why do we call it missing? Basically, since between 1990 and 2013, and we're getting some new data for this, but less than 10% of all housing units produced were this missing middle housing scale. So you can see a tremendous on this diagram, starting in about sort of the late 1970s and 1980s. We really just stopped. We sort of every year we stopped. We built less and less of these types, and so once again, when you think about how we can continue to enable them, there's lots and lots of barriers. There's lots of reasons that they're missing. There's lots of reasons that we've sort of built fewer and fewer of these. And we could have a discussion. I could present for a couple hours on this topic alone. When I wrote my book, it was the first time I was able to actually sit down and sort of do more research and really write a bunch of supporting text about these list of barriers and what cities can be doing to remove them. But the number one barrier that we see in most places that we work, up and down California and across the United States, are these zoning barriers. I'm going to talk a little bit about that. But there's often community opposition because it's not single family detached. I mentioned earlier, they're not easily classifiable by industry standards. They don't easily fit into that single family home or that multifamily classification. And there's just a lot of in California, we have other issues with increased risk to developers who are, especially in terms of for sale missing middle types. That's a barrier that we're working on to remove at a statewide scale. And the sad reality is we used to know how to deliver these types. In the early 1900s, you could actually pick up a Sears and Roebuck catalog. These are 2 pages from an early 1900s Sears and Roebuck catalog, and have a fourplex, a sixplex, or an eightplex delivered to your curbside in this kit of parts that could easily be built and affordably be built on the site. So we've really digressed substantially since over 100 years ago, when we were delivering these in high volumes and delivering these housing choices. So the missing middle housing is middle in 2 different ways. And I'm going to continue to reinforce this. It's first and foremost, it's a middle form and scale that's between that single family and the multifamily, like that diagram that I showed you. And it's really important, this house scale that we talk about related to missing middle. It's not just the height of a building, but it's also the width of a building along a street, as well as the depth of a building sort of going back into a lot. All of those really matter in terms of delivering this house scale, and a scale that's really compatible with the character, even compatible with single family homes that could be sitting right next to it. The second aspect of sort of why we call these middle is that these types historically and even today, when they're executed well, can deliver affordability to middle income households. And that's a really important part of this. When we talk about affordability, we oftentimes automatically default to this sort of a capital A affordable that you see in this upper left hand side, which is affordable housing that requires subsidy, whether it's from the federal government from the city or local agencies or the state. That's capital A affordable. That's not what missing middle is. And on the opposite end of the affordable housing conversation, you have this drive to increase the number of housing units, to increase supply, to try to lower costs. But the missing middle housing types fit right in the middle of that. We often call it attainable housing rather than affordable, because it's affordability by design. It doesn't require subsidies, and if it's executed smartly, it can really sort of be available to households with a broad variety of different household incomes, which is a great way to approach delivering a broad range of choices and price points in your community. So up and down California, if you go to any neighborhood built prior to the 1940s, you're going to find a really amazing range of these missing middle housing types. Here are some examples from Santa Barbara, a cottage court in the middle, a great fourplex on the left-hand side, some courtyard buildings on the right. My hometown here, Berkeley, California, about 20% of all of our neighborhoods are missing middle housing types. A great little sort of C-shaped or L-shaped sort of fourplex that I often pass on my bike when I'm riding to and from work every day. Cottage courts, places like San Luis Obispo. So a lot of places you all are familiar with, just really great. If you look closely, you'll see them, but they blend in so nicely into neighborhoods, even neighborhoods that are mostly single family, that you would never kind of even know that there were multiple units in those buildings. And then great cities like a Pasadena, right? There's just a really amazing mix of these types. If you look closely, you can find them. And I think what's important about just quickly showing you some of those examples is there's a pretty common set of the missing middle housing types that exist in all those different places, but the architecture and some of the form does adapt and modify to sort of address the culture of each community and the history of each community, which is a really nice sort of thing to see as you're comparing examples from different places. In terms of the missing middle housing types, I think one of my recommendations in terms of planning conversations is that let's shift the conversations away from these terms like density, away from concepts like a multifamily housing, or these other terms that we often use in our planning, and just let's step back and start thinking about, well, what is the range of housing types that we'd like to allow in particular sort of carefully identified neighborhoods in our community. So it's really important to introduce this vocabulary and understanding of these types into the community. And I'm going to walk you through some examples, but it's duplex, the cottage court, the multiplex. And so you can have a really healthy conversation about sort of what you want or don't want in certain parts of your community, not based on a random metric, but rather based on a palette of these missing middle housing types. So kind of starting at the lower end of the missing middle spectrum, you have a side-by-side duplex. And this is pretty straightforward. It's simply two units attached on one wall, and they can be either 1 stories or 2 stories. You can see a broad range of examples here in this slide. You have the stacked duplex, which is where you can see on this image on the left, you go in the door to the right, and that door enters the unit that takes up the entire ground floor. The door on the left-hand side here, which you might not even see if you're riding your bike or driving along that street, takes you up a flight of stairs to a unit on the upper story. And once again, right, that's house scale building, but it has 2 units in it. It blends, this particular example blends in to a block that has a lot of single family detached homes and about 10 or 15% missing middle housing types all in the same block. One of a lot of people's favorites is the cottage court, and you have a really rich history of this type, in particular in Southern California. You can find great examples of this. It's just a series of small, typically detached cottages oriented around a shared green space. That green space can take a variety of different sizes. It can be really small. It can be a little bit larger, like this one. Develops a really strong sense of community. And what we find is, in particular, single person households and more specifically, single women households tend to really like to either rent or buy in these cottage courts because it's a built-in sense of security and community that they have when they're living in these places. And we've been studying these types for 20 years now. And I just wanted to show you some examples that are both on our website, missingmiddlehousing.com, but also in my book as well. But we've documented each of these housing types, and we've studied sort of all the metrics that you can kind of sort of generate based on these typical conditions for both a condition where you might have an alley or a lane in the back where the parking is accessed off of, or a condition like this where you actually don't have an alley or a lane and you need to have a side drive access off the street going into the units. Then there's the fourplex. This is one of my favorites. It's just simply 2 units on the ground floor with 2 units stacked on top of it. These are really sprinkled all over these early 1940s neighborhoods. This is a really great example from North Oakland. I just want to once again reinforce this idea. It's the scale of a house. If you didn't look closely at the mailboxes or the number of doors, like this could easily be a single family home. And one of my recommendations to every city is that in the locations where you want to enable missing middle housing is you should be allowing these fourplex types on any lot that's 50-foot wide or wider. That's kind of an interesting metric to be thinking about. Then we have townhouses. There's obviously a really broad range of townhouse forms that can be built, but this is a recently built example from up here in California, in Hercules, California, a traditional neighborhood actually that Victor Dover, who was one of the earlier speakers, actually his company planned this community about 20 years ago. And I just want to make a point about townhouses. We've gone back and forth about potentially removing townhouses from the missing middle sort of palette of types, because if you're not careful and you allow these what we call the tuck under townhouses with the garages on the front, this is likely all that you will get. So you need to be careful about deciding, well, where is it okay to have this, and where do you want to say no to this type? Because we actually feel it's not a really good type. But if you don't actually specifically say no to this type in certain locations, it is what most builders, especially in the production builder markets, will deliver to your communities. Then there's a multiplex, a really great example built in Austin, Texas, a little 8-plex building on the green on the left there. Great little live work units that can have a ground floor space that can incubate a small business and a townhouse unit above it. And then the accessory dwelling unit is just one of the many types. I think this is a conversation that's been happening in a pretty robust way up and down California, and we just encourage this as part of this wide variety of housing choices that we are encouraging in this missing middle housing conversation. And so what are the important characteristics of missing middle housing? I'm going to go through these pretty quickly because I want to talk more about sort of how builders are delivering this and what cities are doing to enable it as well. So the first characteristic, and you're going to hear this over and over, is that missing middle housing performs best when it's located in walkable communities. And that walkability, it's not walkability in terms of being able to put on your sweats and go out the door and walk on a pathway. It's walkability to a destination, and it could simply be a single coffee shop or a cafe that's embedded in the neighborhood, like this one here in this photograph. So it's about, and that's really where the demand is growing for that type of walkable living. Second of all, once again, a theme that I keep repeating, but I feel it's really important. These are compatible in scale with single family homes. All of these types are. This is just a really great example that reinforces that, as this is a triplex. It's in a new community built in the Salt Lake City region. If you didn't know better, if you were driving by this and didn't look very closely, even walking by it, you wouldn't know that this wasn't a single family detached house, and it just happens to be a triplex with 3 units in it. And that's the point here, house scale. Small, well-designed units. A little bit of comic relief, and just to make sure everybody's paying attention. Missing middle, a lot of times they're delivering units at about 1,000 square feet or below. We're not talking about tiny houses here. I'm a big fan of the tiny house movement. I think that plays a role in every city's conversations, but we're kind of talking about one level up, starting at 650, 700 square feet. And then, I mean, they can get a little bit bigger, but usually right around 1,000 square feet is usually a sweet spot. And there's a tremendous market demand for these high quality, 1,000 plus or minus square foot units in a walkable context. We found this in every project either we've designed or our colleagues who are doing similar work have designed as well. A really, really important part of this conversation is that missing middle housing typically has fewer off-street parking spaces. And the point here isn't that we're um, thinking that people are going to live without a car. It's just simply let's get more creative and let's allow developers and architects to get more creative about ways to accommodate the cars within a larger neighborhood plan. And this is actually a photo from a missing middle neighborhood that I'll talk about a little bit more in my case studies that we designed in the Omaha, Nebraska metro that is being delivered. This is actually a sixplex building here that you're seeing, and it's being delivered with one off-street parking space per unit, with one space, additional space for each unit on street on a tree-lined pedestrian scaled street. And so it's working really well. It has over 150 units built now, and it's a very suburban, broadly suburban context. And if it can work there, I'm sure it can really work everywhere. So I just encourage every community to have a really robust, engaging conversation about it's okay to think more creatively about parking, and don't be worried about sort of over regulating off-street parking requirements. It's a really important part of the missing middle conversation, and delivering attainability, because every space you need a developer to deliver, the higher the cost is going to be for that housing unit. Simple construction, affordability by design, I mentioned that earlier. And then last of all, missing middle housing types create a strong sense of community. And I think, a lot of households out there are really, really looking for a strong sense of community. And when these types are allowed, when they're designed well, they can really deliver a strong sense of community, like this cottage company project up in the Seattle region. So who's building missing middle? I'm going to start with sort of giving a little bit more information about this really great project, the cottages on the green, that I showed you this photo of earlier. This is in East Greenwich, Rhode Island. This is just a site plan. It's a site that's less than 1 acre. Tremendous sense of community. It's being delivered on this cottage court format. The units range from about 855 square feet to 1,000 square feet. And you can see what's really neat about it is some of these units are detached homes, but others actually really well designed attached units. So it's a really nice blending of different housing types in a way that a lot of city zoning regulations actually don't allow and don't encourage, for sure. The second project I wanted to show is that project in the Omaha, Nebraska metro. It's a project that we took on to really help redefine multifamily living and to create the country's first missing middle neighborhood. And the idea behind this, sort of reinforcing this idea of missing middle, was let's design a building that looks like a really nice large home from the early 1900s that happens to have 7 units integrated into that same form. And sort of that was the premise behind the creation of this neighborhood. It's 40 acres, about 618 units, laid out as a neighborhood, not a series of sort of just clustered apartment buildings on a site. And it's thinking about a broad range of different types of sub areas within that neighborhood, different experiences, different types of places to live. And it's been hugely successful. This is an aerial photograph of the first 3 phases that were completed, and it's got about 132 units completed, and the market's responding super, super well. Our client's achieving good returns for the risk that he took on this project. And what you're seeing here is on the right is a 5-plex. Up on the upper left is a 4-plex. And on this lower left is a live work building that's actually incubated a small pizza shop and a small yoga studio in a neighborhood oriented Main Street. and some really great parking here. This is the project with one space off street that you can see. It's an alley loaded project. There's all the parking sort of is accessed via a very narrow alley. There's some accessory dwelling units above, and then the streets, these tree-lined streets, have parking on both sides that accommodate the additional parking. And the residents really like the fact that they can park right in front of their front door, within visual distance of their front door, and walk up to that front door and actually have passive surveillance of their car, as opposed to having it parked in a large parking lot in a typical apartment project. It's also delivering a really broad range of price points, starting at about $1,000 per month for a one bedroom, and up to $3,000 a month for one of the larger townhouse units that you see here on the left. And this, as I mentioned earlier, this main street is really critical for delivering that walkability, and it's already sort of in its early stages, incubating that pizza shop, and that yoga studio and a coffee shop is on its way. Another really interesting project that we designed for a large production builder in the Salt Lake City region. There were two issues he had when he approached us. The first one was he was historically a builder of mostly single family detached homes, but he was seeing and understanding that the market was shifting, like I mentioned earlier, and wanted to be able to respond to it. But he really didn't quite know where to go because his history with single family homes, and wanted to know if missing middle could help play a role. The second issue he had is they did start building some townhouses, but the prices for land, the prices for materials, the prices for labor had gone up so much that he couldn't deliver even a townhouse at a price point that an entry-level buyer could buy. So we designed these Muse housing types, which was just a really innovative adaptation on a townhouse that orients onto this pedestrian-only public space that they were able to deliver for at a price point of about $25,000 less per unit to the buyer. And so it opened up a whole range of attainability for households that wouldn't be able to afford even that townhouse that they were delivering due to the increased costs. And what I want to emphasize about this is that these units are between 1,000 and 1,200 square feet. It's a little bit smaller living, but it's also really high quality living. We're not compromising. It's still good design. You can see a double-story living space, and the buyers are really liking the strong sense of community that this project is delivering as well. I think that the last project I just want to mention is a project that we're working on in Tempe, Arizona right now. It's a new missing middle community that will be the largest car-free community in the country when it comes out of the ground later this year. And it's actually, the image that's behind me is one of the courtyard spaces that's being delivered in this car-free neighborhood. And I just want to mention this because if car-free living is happening in Phoenix, Arizona, which is kind of the center of car culture in the United States, there's been tremendous demand. 150 people have given deposits, and there's only 130 units in the first phase, and there's 3,000 renters that are signed up on the interest list. So if it's happening there, I think there's a real strong demand for it everywhere that we need to be thinking about. So the last part of my presentation here is just a really quick overview of some of the typical planning and zoning strategies that we're doing and we're seeing other cities doing across the country. And once again, I want to, in terms of planning, the idea for missing middle and the seed of it was really planted about 20 years ago when we were doing a project in Santa Barbara County for the community of Isla Vista, which I'm sure many of you might be aware of. But we came across this really broad range of amazing missing middle housing types in the neighborhoods adjacent to downtown Santa Barbara. And that really the citizen advisory group that was part of that project. These types and the conversation about these types and the quality of living they provided really resonated with that advisory group. And so that became a core part of that plan and the new zoning that we wrote. In terms of area plans or specific plans, it's a really great idea to be thinking about how these types can be enabled specifically with those area plans or specific plans. We're working on a specific plan for downtown Davis right now, and all that area that you see in the pink on the map on the right is areas where we're thinking about the transitions from the core of downtown, and we're wanting to enable missing middle buildings like the one you see here on the left. And so we've changed the policy, we're changing the zoning, we're writing a new form-based code to enable that range of housing types to transition from downtown into the neighborhoods. Right, there's also tremendous opportunities in every city with grayfield sites and larger opportunity sites. Might be a mall that's kind of seen its better days. It's not performing economically, or that there's a higher and better use for it. Really great opportunities with maybe you have larger buildings sort of fronting onto the corridors. And as you move your way back into the sites, like you can see on this illustration, you integrate missing middle to provide that transition scale into the adjacent neighborhoods, and also provide enough rooftops to support the those commercial and amenities. Right. As I talked with the city about this, working up to this presentation, it seems like there's really two amazing opportunities, and I'm sure there's more, but the lowest hanging fruit might be this Leal property. And even as you think about the evolution, and I know there's a plan in place to think about the evolution of the Eastvale Gateway, like these are great opportunities to be thinking about, well, what role can missing middle play in these opportunity sites that you have throughout your city? In terms of zoning, just need to make the point that we need to allow all of these types by right, not through a negotiation process. And this, I like using this slide to make the point that not all multifamily is the same, and most zoning codes can't tell the difference between this building on the right and the building on the left, because the buildings are the same setback, they're the same height, and they're the same density. But I think we would all agree that these two buildings are not equal when it comes to how they reinforce a character of a community that we would all want in a community that we live in. And so we need to be thinking about what elements about that building on the right or do we need to regulate and require to, so we don't get the building on the left, so we don't get the building on the right as part of the implementation. Often we find in zoning that densities are often too low, minimum lot sizes are too large, setbacks are too large. So, right, there's just really need to go in and sort of turn the dials on all these metrics to make sure that they're enabling missing middle. And we have been proponents for the past 20 years of more of a form-based approach to zoning, where it's more approachable, it's easier to understand, the intent is very clear. I just something that I encourage you to sort of embed in your conversations about a really effective way to deliver predictable implementation of where you decide missing middle makes sense in your general plan process. Just a few concluding thoughts, right? There's this tremendous growing demand for missing middle housing and walkable living. And right, cities like Eastvale have historically provided a really high quality of life. As these demands have shifted and household demographics shift, right, it's a really great opportunity, and you all are being sort of proactive about just having a conversation as you're working on your general plan about what do we need to do to position, what do you need to do to position Eastvale to meet these demands and to provide this new way of living that so many households are looking for, households that currently live there that maybe want to transition to something different, or new households moving in. And so I'm just really excited to be here to help you frame this conversation and sort of build support and build understanding about this need, and so you can start figuring out sort of what you can do to implement and meet this need. Just if you're interested in learning more about this topic, there's a lot of free information on a website that we launched in 2016. It's just missingmiddlehousing.com. I just encourage you to take a look at it. And I will make a small pitch for my book, Missing Middle Housing, Thinking Big and Building Small to Respond to Today's Housing Crisis. It was released of June of last year, 2020. And if you use my last name, you can get a 20% discount on the Island Press website. You can also just go to missingmiddlehousing.com, and that'll lead you to the purchase of that. But it's been a great pleasure to be part of your speaker series. I do really wish you the best of luck of integrating this missing middle concept into your general plan as your conversation progresses. And just a little bit of a call to action is and you can do this as part of your general plan, whether you're a general community member, whether you're a city council member, a planning commissioner, right? You're the part of the planning staff, you're the city manager, you're a real estate, a realtor in Eastvale. We all really play a role in helping our communities adapt and meet these shifting and growing needs. And so it's a little bit of a call for action for every single one of you that listen to this presentation, engage in the conversation to really step up and help the city sort of meet this growing demand for this broad range of housing choices, and most specifically missing middle housing. Thank you.
All right. Well, great. Thank you, Dan. A great presentation. Thank you very much for that. Wanted to, before we get into some of our questions, I definitely wanted to give those in attendance an opportunity to ask questions or make comments. And we do have a raised hand here by Keith White. So I'll go ahead and allow him to talk. Keith, can you hear us?
Can you hear me okay?
Yes, go ahead.
Perfect. Learning Solar Hazel. I have a couple questions. When you did Mr. Video, have you done anything about people, veterans on housing, senior citizens that are getting older? I live in Eastvale. Is there anything about that? Because I don't hear a lot of things about housing for seniors or disabled people or our veterans. Because we need to serve our make sure our veterans have housing and stuff. Like, I'm disabled, so my question is, have you heard anything about that, making sure there's housing for seniors, that are ADA accessibility, stuff like that? That's my concern right now. Thank you.
Yeah, Dan, did you get that? I think he's asking, how does missing middle really accommodate the needs of seniors and disabled veterans?
Yeah, I mean, it's an important part of every city's conversation. I don't think missing middle is the only part of that solution and sort of the needs, but absolutely every missing middle housing conversation should address the needs of seniors, which, as I mentioned in my presentation, it's over 70% of the demand in many places is this aging population over 65 years old. So we need to be thinking about it. Whether it be from a policy standpoint or from an architectural or a planning standpoint, for sure. So good point to bring up. And in terms of disabled, yeah, absolutely. Accessibility needs to be, I mean, there's a lot of requirements that require it to be, but it should be an important part of the conversation because you want these broad range of housing choices to be accessible for everybody. So it is an important part of the conversation for sure. And it's, even though I don't spend a section of my presentation specifically talking about it, every single one of those examples that I showed you that have been built recently all address those aspects of both senior living and accessible living as well.
Awesome, thank you. We do have a couple of questions in the Q&A section, so I'll go ahead and read them out. This one's from Alan Lim. He says, "Hello, Daniel. Great presentation. You brought up a point of a car-free community in Tempe, Arizona. Has there been a plan in place to meet mobility and retail needs for the residents?"
That's a great question. I often sort of have to correct myself because it's a car-free but mobility-rich community. It's partly because it's right next to a light rail station, but that's not where the project stops in terms of meeting mobility. That's actually, the developer is sort of a tech-driven development company, sort of a new, they call themselves the first post-car developer, and they're using technology, whether it be to deliver mobility choices, whether it be scooter share, bike share, Uber and Lyft coordination pickup points throughout the project area, and everything, other really exciting aspects like grocery delivery, food delivery. Some of their partners are the companies that are building this technology of like the delivery robots. And so like they're thinking about, using a project like this to really test some of those new ideas about sort of mobility and just like reasons, you don't need to get in your car because things can be brought to you as well as another aspect. And then in terms of the retail needs, there's a core part of the cul-de-sac Timpani community that's mixed use with ground floor commercial and service uses. There's a co-working space, which is hard to imagine in these times of COVID, but once we get through this, right, the demand for co-working spaces was really growing. There's a coffee shop, there's a small market, there's a gym. So there's a lot of, it wouldn't meet every single need, but there's a large percentage of the needs of the residents that will be met just simply based on the programming. And so it's a good point to bring up. It's not just all housing. It's a mixed use environment. It's a mixed use neighborhood. And so I think that's really interesting. As I mentioned, there's several thousand people on a waiting list. So I think any developer who's sort of excited enough to deliver something like this, I think will do really well in almost any environment where they can deliver these different choices.
Okay, great. Thank you. We do have another question from Michael Rochelle, and his question is, I believe you called them tuck under units, where the garage is placed under the unit. It says, what are the problems with these types of units as I see them all over?
Yeah, it's the one, because right in California, what we saw is single family lots kept getting smaller and smaller over the course of the last 20 years, to the point where the land values are so high that, okay, now we need to do townhouses. But most of the townhouses have the garage taking up the entire ground floor. And what I don't like about them is that if there's just one or two of them and they're exception, like it's one thing, but if you have an entire neighborhood built just of this type, where you're walking down a street and it's all garage doors, like it's not creating a walkable environment. It's not creating an environment that's conducive to sort of community building. Those units aren't accessible because they're up to 3 stories tall, right? They're a bad product type for this growing senior market. And they a lot of times the way they're put together, they don't create the type of environment that's going to increase in value over time, which is the kind of community that most cities are trying to attract a place that not only is attainable from the start, but that in 10 or 15 years, it's just as valuable, just as high quality, and maybe even more in demand. And I don't see that in these tuck under townhouses, because you can be thoughtful about them and do projects that are okay with that type, but I tend to just like encourage cities to just be really thoughtful about, you don't need to not allow them everywhere, but just be really thoughtful, because if you allow them, that's what the industry's building and that's all you will get. So maybe you have some of those, but you have a broader range of mix of types in a neighborhood, and they're just an exception, or just 10 or 15% of the overall mix. So those are the reasons that I don't like them. And it's really where the development industry has gone in California, and we just need to be really cautious. We just caution cities about where to be thoughtful about where to allow them.
Yeah, and I know what you're talking about. I actually went to school up in Berkeley, so I know they're in the Bay Area too. I remember Sunset District right outside of Golden Gate Park. There's a bunch of those, right? And those were built probably in the 60s or 50s, right?
Yes.
And so they've been building them for many years, but it doesn't take away from the fact that as you walk through those neighborhoods, you don't feel like you're really walking anywhere you really want to be walking, right? There's potential cars coming out, or you got to get on the street, and people are parking in those driveways because they're tandem parking. So it creates a lot of issues of walkability. So, creating alley loaded type of garages where you have the frontages fronting onto, and that's where you walk out, is certainly a better design in most planners' books. So all right, so I wanted to see if anyone else had any other questions. I don't see any hands raised. So if anybody has any other questions or comments, feel free to raise your hand or leave a question in the comment or in the Q&A session box. And I don't see anything. So I do have a couple of questions for you, Dan. And so my first question is, given what you know about Eastvale, so we're a city of mostly single family, 3,000, 4,000 square foot homes, right? What type of missing middle housing types do you think would best fit in this community?
Yeah, to be quite honest, I mean, especially on some of these larger opportunity sites, you could easily get this full range of missing middle types that we've talked about, starting at the duplex and going up to like 4, 6, 8-plex for sure. And there may be even opportunities, obviously, for the upper missing middle away from the single family areas. And so I think you definitely can be considering the full range of these types in the right locations. But as those opportunity sites sort of get closer and closer to the existing single family neighborhoods, right, you just want to be thoughtful about, well, hey, on those edges, for example, like we just want to make sure that the relationship, there might even be a relationship across the street, is compatible in scale. as the opportunity sites build out. But I would just encourage you, yeah, let's just add this whole palette of missing middle to your conversation. Then you can be selective as planning processes, sort of those sub area plans happen, to be more selective about which ones will go where.
Yeah, no, we certainly, we're in a young city, but we're almost built out completely, and we don't have any room to grow. So it's really those
Yeah.
opportunity areas that are left to be able to do housing right. That's really, and we got to get it right in the general plan. So
Yeah, and I didn't see this as much in Eastvale just because you are such a young community, but a lot of times we also encourage cities along um, not the major arterials, but secondary corridors where historically they might have been zoned for commercial. We say, well, just assess that. Like, is the commercial still viable along those corridors? And if not, is there an opportunity to introduce in places some of these missing middle types? And that's another place to look. But Eastville, because it's so young, doesn't have a tremendous amount of those opportunities. But it's another place to be looking for sure.
yes, absolutely. Well, thank you. Let me see if there are any other folks anyone who has any questions or comments. Feel free to raise your hand or leave a comment or question in the Q&A box. But I do have other questions for you.
Mhm.
So, how can building missing middle meet the needs of meet the generational needs of our residents? So we have a lot of folks who are living with their grandparents and in a multi-generational families because we have the larger homes, right? And so
Yep.
how can missing middle meet that need?
Absolutely. I didn't talk about it in this presentation, but I often talk about the need for multi-generational housing. And, it first came up 15, 16 years ago in a charrette we were having in King City, and community members kept coming and participating. It's great. And just saying, like, we we choose, some of our households are choosing to live multi-generational, right? It's part of our culture, but all that's being delivered is a single family detached house. So that's what they're buying and they're making do. But there's actually really creative design solutions that can be um, used to accommodate multi-generational living, where yeah, you have three different generations, but if somebody gets tired of each other, like, you can close off a door and you each have your own suite. And but one of the big barriers for doing that has often been the zoning, where you want each one of those suites to have their own kitchenette at the very least. But that then counts as 3 units, and the zoning typically might only allow single family home or maybe two. And so we also need to be thinking about how can we sort of turn the dials on our regulations to enable that multi-generational living and really let it prosper, right? Don't let it be like we're making it work because we have a big single family house, so we're making it work. Let's actually let the market adapt to this really specific need and desire for multi-generational living. um, and the other thing is, what we see is, for example, let's just say an older household, maybe a baby boomer household. They're in their early to mid 60s. Their kids have moved off to college, and they own a big single family house. Well, what a great opportunity. They're like, man, we don't need this big house anymore. We'd love to buy one of those little 850 square foot cottages in that cottage court and encourage 5 of our other friends to do the same thing, right? And then maybe our kids will move back and move into our house after they're done with college. There's just a lot of really interesting ways that if you build these neighborhoods with the missing middle, if you can introduce more missing middle types to the broader Eastville context, it can give even existing households that opportunity to sort of transition in a way that it's been really hard in California. Uh, Homeowners and even renters to like transition in life in their different points of their lives, because we haven't been delivering a lot of choices. And so I think this is a great opportunity to reinforce, give people options that are currently living in Eastvale, but they want something different, or like those households that are living multi-generationally or want to, and what they're living in may not be the perfect solution. And so I think this is a great opportunity to address all of those needs of the community.
Yeah, no, and that's a great point you made about the market letting it dictate it, because
Mhm.
we, the Lennar makes, for example, makes a product that's a builder in our community here. It makes a
Yep.
product that is that has the next gen, right? It has the suite and it's all set up for that, right? And so our zoning allows for that, but it doesn't allow for much more than that. So
Yep.
I think as planners, we control a lot of that, and being able to allow that multi-generational housing to meet the demands, because they're doing it anyway. They're already taking the large house
Yeah.
and creating those spaces, and you're just making it more of a difficult situation. I have my mom who lives with me, and I love her, and I love having her there. My wife loves her, but she's in one of the rooms, and she's
Yeah.
in her
Yeah.
own little space, right? And so
Yeah.
that's something we looked at in buying a house like that. And so it's certainly, the demand is there for sure.
Yeah. You can imagine like even go like the main level of a house being kind of the shared space, or maybe that's the shared space plus where the parents live on the or the maybe that's where the grandparents sort of on a little wing to the back is where the grandparent lives.
Right.
Upper floor is where the parents live, and then up above the garage, which is attached by a wing, is a small accessory unit where the kids coming back from college, maybe early in their careers, are living. It's just like there's some really creative choices that we can enable if we can remove some of those barriers. And I think there's a really pent up demand.
Yeah, great. See, are there any other questions? I don't see any hands raised or any questions in the Q&A. So do have one more question for you. So, I when I lived in the Bay Area, I remember that I lived in a little cottage. I lived in Alameda, if you're familiar with that
Hmm.
town. A little cottage in the back, and then there was a larger home in the front. It was a large Victorian, and the owner lived on the bottom floor, and then he rented the top. So the 3 units on one home.
Yep.
Yeah, can you talk a little bit about your experience in working in communities where where they had to, take larger homes and kind of divvy them up that way? And there's been a lot of community opposition towards that kind of thing sometimes. And so just wanted to get your perspective of that versus building, new housing where you have existing larger homes and you cut them up like that. Just your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think it's especially in a community like yours where you're mostly built out, you should definitely be having that conversation as well, of like where you might want to allow that when and what the benefits are or challenges. Because I think the challenges in a lot of communities, especially in communities with universities, like that was done really poorly historically in a way that kind of compromised the neighborhoods. But I think there's a need for it, and I think there's a need for it. There's a demand for it, like um, at all different market levels. It's not just kind of like we're doing this because trying to attract kind of the lowest price uh, renter or buyer. Like there's people choosing to like live in a missing middle type, living that walkability. They want it, and so I think cities should be thinking about that. So I would definitely encourage you to talk about it. I want to mention the city of Los Angeles is actually hosting a low-rise design competition, and I'm one of the jury members. And one of the categories, it just made me think, because one of the categories is they're asking for submittals of taking a pre-existing house and showing how it could be split up into, I can't remember if it was a duplex, triplex, or fourplex, but it might be worth just keeping your eye on that and maybe sharing some of that information with the Eastvale community as that information is made public.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for that.
Mhm.
Yeah, we'll look into that. Um, I don't see any other questions. So I do have another question for you.
Mhm.
So you talk a lot about the missing middle, and I wanted to see if you can elaborate a little bit more about the economic or the economic benefits of having the missing middle filled, right? You get more housing, you get more on per acreage, more housing per acreage, so your tax dollars could potentially go up or will go up. But can you talk just a little bit more about how a city can benefit from having missing middle housing versus traditional single family residential?
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm chuckling in my head because that's a really great sort of lead into Joe Minicozzi's presentation, which is next. Doing the math. He's a colleague we've worked on in some projects, but he'll really dive deeply into the numbers with some really informative graphics that kind of represent some of the work that how they're assessing sort of the benefits to cities. But what I would say is it's a lot of these things we've talked about over the course of this Q&A that I presented is that are beneficial. It's right. It's keeping people in your community, and it's also attracting other new people to your community, which obviously has its benefits. It's allowing your community to evolve in a way that sort of, it started with your word cloud, as we want walkability, as we want mixed housing, we want mixed use, and it's meeting the needs of your community members, so that it continues to be an attractive place to live as people's needs and what they want changes. But it can also ultimately, right, it can attract businesses as well, the right businesses, if you're smart with your planning, that are obviously beneficial to your fiscal bottom line as well. So yeah, I think for all those reasons, I think it can benefit like the existing residents as their lifestyles and needs change. It can help the bottom line in terms of your the taxes that you're bringing in, but um, and retention of businesses, sort of encouraging new businesses to come in. And I am more than confident that Joe will make a really compelling case for the economic reason that you should be sort of enabling the missing middle where it makes sense in Eastvale.
Right. Yeah, and a great point. And again, I go back to the point of the fact that we have, very little land left to develop. And you brought up a good point about, there are shopping centers where you could potentially put some housing, underutilized shopping centers. So I'm curious to see the performance of how a underperforming shopping center versus bringing in some mixed uses where you still have a little bit of retail, but maybe some housing in it as well. How that kind of fares.
Yeah, and just one other seed to plant, and I'm sure Victor talked about this and maybe some of your other speakers, but we've done a number of projects recently for cities that are looking about, how to address this desire for placemaking, especially in a community like yours that's so young and mostly auto-oriented, and also just this desire to have a more authentic experience rather than kind of going to a fast food restaurant. And just thinking about how you can utilize, and this isn't missing middle related, this is more about placemaking and community development more broadly, is taking some of that space like in your parking lots and like encouraging and allowing creative uses like food trucks and shipping container sort of activities that can really, that's what people are looking for, like those proven business models for everything from like really well thought out shipping containers sort of clustered in a group of businesses and restaurants. And I think in Las Vegas, they have like a really large slide, like things for kids to do. And like, you in the short term, you could absolutely sort of meet the desires of some of your community members in this walkability by sort of thinking incrementally about how you can utilize some of that space that historically has been allocated just for cars, but like, let's make this people space, let's take what we have and just think incrementally about how we can, well, and then let's plant the seeds. Is eventually, based on the planning documents I've seen, like the goal is that some of those places evolve into really delivering like an urban environment, right? A walkable, mixed use, vibrant environment, but that's not going to happen overnight. And so plant some of those seeds and in some of those activities and services and places that people want to go, is something I would recommend that sort of you have a conversation about as well.
Yeah, and great point. That's that's what the community is asking us for. They're asking us for entertainment uses. They kind of have an idea what it is, but when you bring these really cool kind of uses, like you said, food trucks and shipping containers, with anywhere where that has gone, as you've seen, they've been really successful. I can't think of one where it's kind of failed, and maybe there are some out there, but generally it's been successful. And then you couple that with higher density housing around it, and you get people to walk into it, and it's just it blows it out of the water. So no, great point.
Because we did a bunch of work in Seaside, Florida, which is one of the earliest new urbanist communities, on their town center and their the square, and it was started 40 years ago. And they often joke they started it by just opening the tailgate of a pickup truck and selling Seaside t-shirts and cold beers. And it's still 40 years later, it's still evolving. It sort of grew incrementally as the market demand grew. So it's just good way. It's a great way to think about placemaking.
Right. And that town's been, it's what, 20, 40 years now or something like that?
I think it's just over right at 40 or a little over 40 now.
No, that's great. One more question for you. So in terms of the, let's see, I lost my question here. Housing has been converted. Oh, yeah. So in terms of can you talk a little bit more about the type the type of resident that we're losing by not providing the missing middle, right? So it's entry level housing. It's affordable. You talk a little bit about affordable housing, right? And who are those folks that we're basically not providing housing for? And I know who they are, and you know who they are, but I want you to talk a little bit about that. Yeah.
No, it's a great question, and it's right. I mean, it's the teachers, it's the firemen, it's the planners, it's the
and it's our young folks, right?
It's the young folks, people early on in their professions, just getting out of college, just first job. All of those people sort of are in dire need of houses at price points that are really hard to find now. I mean, just as an example, the neighborhood I live in Berkeley, just up the street about a block, there's a triplex. So my neighborhood is a mix of, it's about 80% small lot, single family detached houses, bungalows, like typical California bungalows. And then the other 20% is a mix of, I have a duplex on both sides of me. There's
what neighborhood do you live in?
I live in Westbury, which is sort of Gilman Hopkins Street. But a block and a half away is a triplex. And so my son's kindergarten teacher lives in one unit. Her mother, who's a first grade teacher at the same school, lives in the second unit. And the third unit is occupied by her brother-in-law and sister. And her brother-in-law is the PE teacher at my daughter's middle school. Right. So it's working here. And that's just an example of like, this is how those teachers would not be able to live in this neighborhood, unfortunately. Actually, I wouldn't be able to afford to live in this neighborhood if I hadn't bought my house 15 years ago. But right, that enables the young people, the teachers, some of the people that are the service workers that are like supporting the businesses, making the business happen. Like all those people need these choices. And so, it's interesting because it's important that missing middle, definitely there's a dire need for it for that segment. But, it's also desirable from, like we talk about these baby boomers, that, they can actually afford something bigger, but they want something smaller.
Exactly.
And I think
now it opens up a unit for someone else, right?
Yeah, over the course of years, like it's not going to be immediately. Over the course of the years, if we let that cycle happen and not sort of have a system that encourages the baby boomers to stay in their 3 or 4 bedroom house, till the very end, is like, let's let this cycle happen where they make the logical decision to downsize at some point, and either their kids or they sell it and somebody else can afford to buy it. And that's what we've stopped from happening in California, which has been a really big part of the problem of just, there's a lot of different moving parts that we need to sort of oil again and get them moving to make our housing market more healthy and accessible to a broader range of households.
Yeah, and the irony is too that Eastvale, when it first developed, it was that affordable housing place that where people, those teachers, those paramedics, those folks that were working in Orange County and LA moved out here because of that, and now we're kind of becoming the same, and it's just going to go on, right? And so that it's important that we provide housing for everyone, and
Absolutely. And I'm excited that you're having the conversation. It's with a community that's so young, a lot of times it's just a little bit more challenging to figure out where you might enable this, but it is an important part of it of how can a place like Eastvale evolve and adapt and
right.
stay competitive and sort of continue to deliver the high quality of living that it has historically. And these are all first steps and sort of plugging these ideas and policies into your general plan.
Yeah, and we're a young city, so a lot of folks here have young families. So eventually those kids are going to grow up and they're going to have to live somewhere, and they're going to live with you if there isn't housing available for them, right? And that's what's happening in a lot of other places. They're 30-year-olds, 25-year-olds can't move out because they don't have housing. There's no housing affordability in their areas, right? So, yep. All right. Well, let's see. I don't have any other questions. That's all the questions that I have. I know we're about 10 minutes away from our finish mark here. So we can, if anyone has any other questions, we're happy to entertain them, any of our panelists or any of the attendees. Happy to take any questions. If not, I think we can end it there. I think we'll end a little early. But no, it was great having you, Dan. Really appreciate it, and great presentation. And I think,
Gus,
yes.
Let's tell everybody where they can find this presentation.
Yeah, so it is going to be available on the Engage Eastvale website. We will upload it as soon as we get the survey. It'll go out with the survey usually, so you can watch it and then be able to fill out the survey. So the survey would go out next week. So in about less than a week, it should be up on the Engage Eastvale website, and where all the other previous sessions are already there. So.
Well, thank you. It's been a pleasure to be part of your speaker series. I'm always happy to sort of plant the seeds of this conversation, and I just wish you the best of luck in your general plan process. And I look forward to seeing how you've creatively integrated it into your general plan, and can kind of think about that evolution of Eastvale in moving forward.
Absolutely. Well, thank you very much, Dan. Thank you very much. And so, folks, that's it. That's it for tonight. We'd like to wish everyone a happy evening, and we will see you on the next one. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.